In our very first session on the imagination, I introduced a figure who has become a kind of muse for me in this project, and that is Woman Wisdom from the book of Proverbs. And she fascinates me because she is a woman and thus gives another face to philosophy from many of the faces that we know. But I'm also interested in her because the authors of the book of Proverbs fashioned this powerful icon of God's creative powers from Near Eastern cults and wisdom literatures. And so for me, part of what woman wisdom represents is the international and global quality of wisdom understood as a compendium of teachings and exercises that show up in traditions around the world. So today, I want to look first, kind of return to woman wisdom in scripture. I know we've got many new members as well as continuing members each week. I want to look at her in the context of her analogs in Near Eastern wisdom literature, especially the Egyptian goddess Isis. And then I want to suggest some connections among woman wisdom, Isis, and Cleopatra. First of all, I'd like to talk about the word wisdom and what wisdom evokes in Shakespeare's era in the Renaissance. First, as we saw last week, wisdom often refers to proverbs and maxims, right? These condensed statements designed for integration into life through acts of reading, reflection, commentary, and new composition, as explored by Sean in his remarks last Monday. The word wisdom in the Renaissance was often also shorthand for pagan wisdom, especially Greek philosophy, poetry, and myth, but it could also refer to Egyptian wisdom, Persian wisdom, and other farther flung bodies of spiritual knowledge. And finally, wisdom could also refer to particular books of the Hebrew Bible, those books that don't concern the laws and history of Israel or the prophets of Israel, but rather moral teachings and ethical reflections. These include the highly normative book of Proverbs, all the way to the more existentialist book of Job and Kohelet or Ecclesiastes. Now, woman wisdom really has her feet in all three of these areas. She frames the book of Proverbs, and thus she must have something to teach us about proverbial wisdom. And it's interesting that a kind of parallel figure to Polonius in Shakespeare is the Countess Roussillon in All's Well That Ends Well, who gives very similar advice to her son as Polonius gives to his. She's a kind of woman wisdom. Wisdom, the book of Proverbs belongs to the Hebrew wisdom books. In the Hebrew canon, there's Psalms and then Proverbs is number 2 in the Ketuvim or other writings in which the wisdom books are collected. And finally, she really has that international quality, that pagan quality, insofar as she is modeled on Near Eastern goddesses of wisdom, love, and fertility. So here are some selected verses from Proverbs 8. And I shared some of these with you in my session on the imagination.
I was set up from everlasting, from the beginning, or ever the earth was. When there were no depths, I was brought forth. When there were no fountains abounding with water. When he prepared the heavens, I was there. When he set a compass upon the face of the depth. Then I was by him, as one brought up with him, and I was daily his delight, rejoicing always before him.
Thank you. That was beautiful. So there's a couple of things to note here. Wisdom is associated with God's creative capacities, creative with a capital C, having to do with creation itself. She was with him before the world came into being. And she's represented as a counselor, as a consort, or a confidant. She's also depicted as his delight, like a daughter whose capacities for imaginative play bring joy to the parents. And she's an unusual figure because she has an almost goddess-like quality here, giving her own speeches, her own eratologies or praises of her virtue. And Bible scholars suggest that woman wisdom is based on a range of Near Eastern goddesses of love, wisdom, and fertility. They would include, for example, Ishtar or Ashtare. This is a Canaanite fertility statuette found in the Gaza Strip, older than the Book of Proverbs, which were perhaps the very oldest parts of which might be around 800 BCE. In addition to these Canaanite goddesses, scholars have also suggested connections with the Egyptian goddess Isis. Here's a very old Isis from Egypt. And here is an Isis from Ashkelon. Ashkelon is a Canaanite port city where many cultures mix through trade and warfare. And notice that she is pictured nursing her son Horus. This image of Isis nursing her son is very, very widespread and would later be adapted into representations of Mary and the infant Jesus. And then here is a later Isis, and she looks like a Greek sculpture. In fact, she is a Greek sculpture. This reveals the Greek influence on the Isis cult under the Ptolemies, who were the Greek rulers of Egypt, and is maybe composed a little bit later than the woman wisdom poems of Proverbs 1 through 9. So if we kind of want to visualize how Isis and woman wisdom might be part of this broader Near Eastern dialogue among female personifications of wisdom, we can think about there being both a very ancient kind of substratum as early as 1000 BCE, in which Isis joins with other Near Eastern goddesses and has some impact on the Book of Proverbs, which is composed over a series of many centuries. And on the other hand, a more recent kind of influx, where we have the Greek Isis, the Isis who merges with Aphrodite, a Hellenistic merging, which may also be shaping how wisdom is conceived in Proverbs 1 through 8 of the Book of Proverbs. Now, these goddesses enter the Book of Proverbs, in a positive light through the figure of wisdom, but they also come into the Book of Proverbs in a more negative light. Woman wisdom is opposed to woman folly, and woman folly is identified with a figure called the strange woman, whose foreignness is clearly marked. And here she is coming on to a young man who is seeking wisdom. And maybe someone could read this for me. Jan, I see you there with your mic. So would you read these lines for us?
Yeah. I have decked my bed with coverings of tapestry, with carved works, with fine linen of Egypt. I have perfumed my bed with myrrh, aloes, and cinnamon. Come, let us take our fill of love until the morning. Let us solace ourselves with loves.
Beautiful, thank you. So this really sounds like erotic verse, right? And she's exotic. She has her fine linen of Egypt. She's associated with Egypt. She has exotic odors, spices that make her very attractive. And she's basically saying, come and spend the night with me. It has a kind of secular lyric verse quality to it. Very sensual, as Cerise comments. So woman wisdom and the strange woman represent different strategies, right, of cultural contact and communication between neighboring wisdom traditions. On the one hand, naturalizing and adapting foreign material in the form of woman wisdom, and on the other hand, isolating and opposing these foreign influences. So as we move towards Shakespeare, I want to say a few things about Cleopatra. First of all, she was the last of the Ptolemies, the Greek Macedonian rulers of Egypt. When she dies in 30 BCE at her own hand with the help of a snake, we have the end of the Hellenistic period and the beginning of the Roman Empire. She identified herself with Isis and Aphrodite in her royal cult, and we have various visual images and historical accounts of this royal cult. She was highly educated in Greek philosophy, and she spoke many languages, including Hebrew. She lost the war with the Romans, who got to tell her story their way. And that is the story that largely Shakespeare tells. So Shakespeare's main source for the play is the Greek Platonist and Delphic priest Plutarch, who wrote biographies of famous men, including Mark Antony. But Plutarch also wrote essays, as Sean indicated last week, the Moralia, translated as the Morals, some of which appeared in English in 1603. And one of those essays is on Isis and her consort Osiris. And this is a fascinating piece. It's a lengthy essay, a kind of database cataloging what Shakespeare might have known about Isis. And one of the things that Plutarch says is he identifies her with wisdom. He says that she is a goddess, exceptionally wise, and a lover of wisdom, right? A lover of wisdom is a philosopher, right? Philosophy is philosophia, the lover of wisdom. So he's identifying Isis with his own vocation of philosophy. Isis worship was a big part of Ptolemaic Egypt, which combined Greek and Egyptian mythology in new formations. Isis also made her way to Rome. The image here is from the temple of Isis at Pompeii, which is southeast of Naples. And notice that the attributes of Isis include the snake and also the crocodile here at the bottom of the image, right, which are both images that appear in Shakespeare. And Plutarch's essay, interestingly, is addressed to a female reader, a priestess of Isis named Clea, whom he addresses as a fellow lover of wisdom, as a fellow philosopher. And the image that you see here is also from that same temple of Isis at Pompeii. And what we see here are female worshipers of Isis. They are clearly from several races. Some of them are enslaved, and some of them are free or freed women worshiping Isis together. So what do we make of all of this in Antony and Cleopatra? One of the questions that I have coming to this text with wisdom and Isis in mind include, in what sense does Cleopatra identify herself with the goddess Isis? To what extent might she be said to practice wisdom or even to love wisdom? This might include practical wisdom as a ruler, but also a more philosophical wisdom, having to do with an understanding of an identification with cosmic order, the sublime architecture of creation, which we see celebrated in Proverbs 1-9. So is Cleopatra wise? Well, Shakespeare, like everyone else in his generation, is telling the Roman story. And for the Romans, Cleopatra is a seducer, a virago, an emasculator. She seems flighty and petty and easily jealous. She is more like the strange woman of the book of Proverbs than she is like woman wisdom. Yet, as the play progresses, we can really feel Shakespeare warming up to Cleopatra, and she increasingly commands our respect as well as our fascination. And that dignity really culminates in the extraordinary scene in which she kills herself. And so at this point, I'm going to ask Maya Smoot to join us and to share with us this extraordinary speech.
Give me my robe. Put on my crown. I have immortal longings in me. Now no more the juice of Egypt's grape shall moist this lip. Yar, good Iris, quick. Methinks I hear Antony call. I see him rouse himself to praise my noble act. I hear him mock the luck of Caesar, which the gods give men to excuse their after wrath. Husband, I come. Now to that name my courage prove my title. I am fire and air. My other elements I give to baser life. So, have you done? Come then, and take the last warmth of my lip. Farewell, kind Charmian. Iris, long farewell. Have I the aspic in my lips? Dost fall? If thou and nature can so gently part, the stroke of death is as a lover's pinch, which hurts and is desired. Dost thou lie still? If thus thou vanishest, thou tells the world it is not worth leave taking. This proves me base. If first she meet the curled Antony, he'll make demand of her and spend that kiss which is my heaven to have. Come, thou mortal wretch, with thy sharp teeth, this knot intrinsicate of life at once untie. Poor venomous fool, be angry and dispatch. Oh, couldst thou speak that I might hear thee call great Caesar ass unpolicied. Oh, peace, peace. Dost thou not see my baby at my breast? That sucks the nurse asleep. Oh, sweet as balm, as soft as air, as gentle. Oh, Antony. Nay, I will take thee too. What? Should I stay?
Thank you, Maya. That was beautiful.
Thanks.
That was really great. So I'm going to kind of focus on the first part of this speech. And I'm interested in what are the features that give this speech its sublimity and that link Cleopatra to both the cult of Isis and also to the love of wisdom. So let me start with the fact that the speech begins with the sublime act of costuming, right? She says, "Give me my robe, put on my crown. I have immortal longings in me." She is dressing as a queen, but she's also dressing as a goddess, since sovereignty had a divine dimension for the Ptolemies. And later in the speech, she describes herself as nursing the snake. She becomes a mother and child composite, recalling those images of Isis nursing the infant Horus, while also using the snake, who is an attribute of Isis. Earlier in the play, in a very strong cultic moment, she and Antony had dressed up as Osiris Dionysus and Isis Aphrodite, melding Greek and Egyptian mythology in a public marriage ceremony that was also a division of the kingdoms among her children being the children of both Julius Caesar and Mark Antony. This too is a kind of marriage, right? She says, "Husband, I come." to the absent Antony. Now to that name, my courage proved my title. Courage is a noble virtue. It's one of the 4 cardinal virtues in ancient philosophy. It's a heroic virtue, it's a masculine and a sovereign virtue, and she is summoning all of her strength to achieve what she calls my noble act, a phrase that is not frequently used of women in Shakespeare's plays. This is a virago-like summoning of her nobility and sovereignty and divinity in this action. It's a marriage, and Antony plays a large part in the erotic tableau that is being developed here. But it's a marriage that is interestingly conducted without Antony present. His body has already been removed by the Romans from the stage. Instead, it's a ritual completed with her women, who are like priestesses in a cult of Isis, right? Recall those images of the Roman temple of Isis at Pompeii, where we saw women of different social classes and races engaged in spiritual exercise together. And that might begin pointing us to the wisdom elements here, how spiritual exercise functions here in her speech. One key phrase to me would be her desire to become fire and air. Right? In ancient cosmology and physics, there are 4 elements: fire, air, earth, and water. And she's leaving what she calls baser life of human embodiment, right? We're 90% water, and you might say the other 10% is earth, right? She's leaving the water and earth that compose the creaturely person in order to resolve into these higher elements of fire and air. And think here of woman wisdom present with God at creation, right, as his consort, participating with him in the elemental design of the world. Thought, ideation resembles fire and air, right, in its velocity, in its immateriality, right, with meditations as swift as thought. And she just defines this as immortal longings, right? She has immortal longings, beautiful phrase. In dying, she is becoming one with the universe in its cosmic ordering. It's not dust to dust, but dust transmogrifying into fire and air. Finally, in staging her suicide, it's really fascinating that the Egyptian queen is actually participating here in Stoic philosophy, right? The Stoics often ended their lives in these noble acts of suicide. Antony had tried to kill himself in the Roman fashion, but it took a long time. And it's a very botched, drawn out, awkward affair. Cleopatra, on the other hand, has actually done research on different types of poisons and is fully prepared to die when and how she wants to. Here is an image of her death scene surrounded by her maidens, her priestesses, if you will. The ancients defined philosophy as, quote, learning how to die. We see this in the Stoics, and we also see it in Montaigne. And learning how to die is what she has achieved. And it's interesting to compare this painting of the death of Cleopatra surrounded by her women to this rather similar painting of the death of Socrates surrounded by his students. Both of them have learned how to die and have learned how to die in these communities of exercise. So what is my argument or my current thinking in this inquiry into Cleopatra and wisdom? Well, here's a couple of points that I would want to make. First of all, Shakespeare inherits the Roman portrait of Cleopatra as the strange woman, as the jealous seductress whose intelligence is merely shrewd. we have to grant that much to the Roman account of the story. But Shakespeare is working with rich materials that have deep roots in global wisdom traditions. And these global wisdom traditions include the wanderings of Isis in Egypt, Greece, and Rome. They also include Hebrew wisdom literature's own vexed relationship with neighboring goddesses and foreign queens. And it seems to me that these wisdom resources bubble up in the increasingly powerful portrait of Cleopatra as a learned woman, as an astute ruler, and as a spiritually attuned and spiritually ambitious stager of meaningful ceremonies, who has managed to use philosophy to learn how to die. I have a lot more to say about this. As I said before, this is the beginning of an inquiry for me, but I think I'll stop here and we can perhaps discuss Cleopatra, Isis, Proverbs, whatever else triggered your fancy, your interest, your fire and air in this conversation.
We have to remember that at that time, up before that time in history, women were the ones who were considered the wisest of all. They were the goddesses. And until the men came across the mountain and they brought their male gods with them. So the woman was the goddess. The woman was the strong one. And Cleopatra, I think, is the tail end of that era when the woman was the strong one. And because a man writes about her 1,500 years later, he takes what the Romans who no longer deified women had with them. He takes that point because it's the masculine thing to do. It's demeaning to women. And he gives his approach to her is tolerantly acceptive of the fact that she was probably a heck of a lot smarter than everybody else around.
Yeah, well, he certainly frames her initially very much in the Roman box, which is not an especially empowering box. But as the play progresses, he seems to become increasingly open to her complex mythological roots. And I focused on Isis, but the Mars, Venus, Greek mythology plays a huge role in this drama. Greek mythology, both as separate from Egyptian and also in these Ptolemaic combos that we see in the art of the period of the ancient world and in Renaissance writings and Plutarch and others. So yeah, I think that's really right. And I think the woman wisdom is such an interesting figure to me because she, belongs to monotheism. So she's part of the Hebrew Bible and is in this relationship with the single God. But she clearly also echoes and fills out sort of other aspects of that God in dialogue with neighboring traditions. So that's part of my interest in her. What are people's other thoughts about this? I know.
I have a thought I'd like to
Yes.
throw in. I'm sort of trying to retrieve something from the archive, so it may not come out fully formed. But one of the least appealing metaphors that Erasmus uses for the collection of ancient material, or for the idea of the ancient tradition itself, I believe he gets it from St. Jerome, who used it in relation to the process of translating the Bible into Latin, is the idea of stealing the Egyptians' treasure as though they are the Jews fleeing from Egypt during the book of Exodus, right? So the tradition, which is internationalized here again, but begins in Egypt, is said to be tantamount to Egyptian gold that the Israelites take with them when they go to the promised land. So that's one metaphor. And then the other metaphor that both Erasmus and Jerome use is that of the captive woman. So it's a similar, I don't know if the captive woman is Egypt or not, but she's often invoked in this metaphorical context. a woman that someone has taken captive and changed her appearance by cutting away her fingernails and her ornaments and her long hair and domesticated her into a new tradition. Right, so those are the metaphors that Erasmus and Jerome, I'm saying, and lots of others use for the process of translating old literature, old philosophy, old wisdom into a new context. And I think, based on what Julia has been saying about the play today, that has to be there in the background, shaping our perception of Cleopatra. When the Roman men talk about her in the play, they say things like, or Antony says to her, "I found you a morsel on a trencher," meaning I found you as a piece of food on a fork for a Roman man who preceded me here, Julius Caesar, and before him Pompey. So she's in that situation of not only being this amazing sort of majestic figure in her own kingdom, but she's also perceived to be an object to be taken possession of by Roman conquerors. So I think that's also making the case that she has a figurative relationship to the past that Shakespeare is bringing forward in the play itself.
Yeah, I think that's beautiful. And those are tropes that I've been kind of diving into in the play as images of the purification of a common wisdom base that we see that, Christian commentators in particular are so concerned about how do we purify these materials so that we can use them. But we can see that same purification process going on in the creation of woman wisdom in Proverbs, that she is a kind of Egyptian gold who has been adapted and integrated into the cosmology, but then with woman folly and the strange woman there as kind of, counter types to her. And I think there are really some fascinating passages in Antony and Cleopatra. I mean, why does she kill herself? She doesn't want to become a captive woman. She doesn't want to be the spoils in Antony's triumphs, the parade of his power. And so she resists that role by learning how to die, by staging this noble suicide. There's also a wonderful moment towards the end of the play where she says, I have all these treasures for you, she says to the conquering Roman Octavius. And it turns out that she's kept some of that treasure back. She's reserved some gold for herself. And so I thought that was also interesting in terms of that metaphor that Sean just referred to about the gold of the Egyptians being a figure for wisdom. So Linda says that Shakespeare was familiar with the Queen, right? Queen Elizabeth, who was certainly aware of Cleopatra as a kind of model and countermodel for her own reign. So yes, and there's a nice comment here from Amira. Amira, do you want to turn off your mic or turn on your mic and share this comment about Egyptian pharaohs?
Hi. So ancient Egyptian pharaohs were also deities. And in order to hold her reign, Cleopatra would have also taken on that function and role. And, I think that was certainly known. That was part of her strength over Egypt and controlling it. And he's writing at the time where Queen Elizabeth is also a strong, considered, I think, wise, maybe considered wiser more currently than at the time, but still a strong woman, queen, not a deity per se, but she did sort of take on some of that in the sense of staying married to England and no other, the claim of a virgin queen. I don't know how accurate that part exactly is, but, being sort of this heightened royal figure, it's like in both cases to hold control over a nation that's probably generally patriarchal, as so many, well, all are, or have been, there's this strength and then a wisdom with it, at least politically. So there's, if nothing else, political wisdom. Anyway, I think that he's writing and he's got kind of both contexts there.
Yeah, I think that's very relevant. This play is written after the death of Queen Elizabeth. This is a Jacobean play, but certainly Elizabeth and Cleopatra were bound up with each other in, you know, various forms of both propaganda and anti-propaganda, anti-Elizabeth and pro-Elizabeth writings. So that's very appropriate. And yeah, I mean, there was a sense of sovereignty in England also having a divine element to it, but not nearly to the extent as in Egypt, and in Rome, where deification of rulers, you know, becomes very much part of the cult of monarchs. And so she was very, very much, and she didn't invent this, the Ptolemies were doing this for generations. And so when the historical Cleopatra adopts Isis, very much in the line of the previous Cleopatras.
Yeah,
that was the
pharaohs
common
were
theme.
ancient for generations before even the Greek Ptolemy reign. They had
Right, before the Greeks come in, of course.
they were
Yes,
very much that way.
absolutely. So there's a question here from Carol and from Brad. If Cleopatra is wise in learning how to die, what is the substance of her knowledge, her method or her timing, her spectacle? Well, it's really interesting. I had some more slides on that, which I cut, trying to keep the presentation to 20 minutes. She actually did research on how to die. And this is recorded in Plutarch's Life of Mark Antony, which is Shakespeare's main source for the life of Cleopatra, although not his only one. And Plutarch says that she actually did research using different snakes and poisons on prisoners. And so a kind of a medical research, an unconsented medical research in which she was studying, you know, how to die. And this actually, oddly enough, there comes up in the Talmud, in Tractate Nida. There's a fascinating passage where the rabbis talk about Cleopatra having done research on on imprisoned maidservants in order to determine the time of conception. So it's a kind of rather than about death, about birth. But so there are these traditions of representing Cleopatra as kind of sponsoring medical research on vitality, on birth and death. In terms of learning to die in a more stoic or philosophical sense, earlier in the play, she pretends to be dead, and then she actually kills herself. And one of the things which the Stoic philosophers counsel as spiritual exercise is what they call the rehearsal of death. The death will be less frightening if you practice it in your mind, if you demystify it, if you can convince yourself that it's not so bad. You go through the process of thinking through its inevitability. And so, is Cleopatra in rehearsing death in that earlier scene and then actually accomplishing it in this scene? It's an interesting thing to think about. We do know that the historical Cleopatra had philosophers in her court, was highly educated, and would have read in Greek philosophy, and would certainly have known about both Stoicism and Epicureanism, which each had their own spiritual exercises around naturalizing death, depriving death of its sting, to quote Milton.
What I really like about Julia's way of setting this up for us today is that it makes it possible to see the rehearsal for death and the preparation for dying as something other than a parody of those concepts, right? Because, Cleopatra and Antony are dubious hero figures in their own play. And you could see this aspect of the play as Shakespeare sort of looking skeptically at the whole how to die thing. But I was just going to add to that part of our conversation that, the Stoics do not recommend committing suicide. They recommend going on living until you are in a situation that is genuinely so intolerable and so beyond your power to fix or ameliorate, right? That suicide becomes a dignified and legitimate option. And so I think a little bit the discussion of her preparation for death and her suicide has to be seen in terms of what is causing it and what it achieves, right? Because Antony, those of you who know the play will remember that Antony, his dying words to her are, "Go on living," right? He tells her to trust a certain person around Caesar as someone who will ensure her survival in the transition between their forces and Caesar's taking control of the world. So, I mean, that's a question I throw out to Julia and to the rest of you. What does, why does Cleopatra think she's met her match in Octavian or Caesar, right? When she has seduced 3 other Caesars and made them her partners in her own kingdom. But more importantly, what does her death, for which she's been rehearsing, what does it achieve in terms of the play as a whole? Julia and I have been trying to avoid talking about the play as a whole, right? Trying to keep this sort of on the level of wisdom, but I think that is an important question here. You could argue that she's just taking the easy way out and avoiding being led in triumph as a captive in Octavian's parade in Rome, and that is part of her concern. But I think something else is achieved by her death that might help us to understand why Shakespeare is so interested in the process of learning how to die. Julia, what do you think she creates, to use some of your word, by virtue of this theatrical spectacle at the end?
Well, I mean, she creates a tableau which is, becomes her legacy. I mean, so there's like 2 ways to think about immortal longings. And one is sort of becoming one with the universe in this elemental kind of remapping of creation that she does in her death, which I would say is the kind of philosophical or mystical or esoteric element of immortal longings. But immortal longings for the Greeks and Romans would also have to do with fame, with how is one's story remembered. And I think she knows the Romans are going to get to tell the story, but she wants to have as much control over that storytelling as she can. And so creating this tableau seems very much part of that. And the fact that tableau has then been translated and transmitted and continues to carry a power in it that is not simply controlled by the Roman mastering of her story, I think is really important. And I think for Shakespeare, it's really important because this play is one of his later plays. I think it's around 1606. I'm bad with dates, Sean, but 1606, 1608. This is we're moving into, it's a tragedy, but it's also a kind of a history play, and it has aspects of the romances. And all of Shakespeare's romances, or at least most of them, The Tempest would be an exception, Shakespeare's romances end in these scenes that are very much like the Temple of Isis. There's scenes where women are centers of semi-cultic transformations and metamorphoses that involve their own renewal and the renewal of others in complex relationships of spectatorship and contemplation and artistic reverence. So the Winter's Tale, with the statue scene at the end in this kind of gallery chapel space. Pericles ends at the Temple of Diana in Ephesus, which is a very Isis-like, it's a very Eastern part of the Greek world. And the Diana has many, many qualities that are not simply Hellenistic to her. The Diana of Ephesus, you might have seen with multiple breasts, almost like an animal running down her chest. Cymbeline, in which we have the Princess Imogen, who has this incredible bedroom that's like a museum. It's like a gallery. It's like the Library of Alexandria. It's very Alexandrian. It includes a tapestry featuring Cleopatra. So part of Imogen's routine, her own reading practices, she has a copy of Ovid, and then she is surrounded by these images, that her humanistic education, her education in wisdom, includes some study of Cleopatra. Now, in that place, she moves away from that bedroom and through a landscape, wandering as Isis does in search of her husband. But there's a kind of Alexandrian, by Alexandrian, I mean a Greco-Egyptian quality to the kinds of studies that Imogen, the priestess, undergoes, the kinds of mysteries that she undergoes. So Antony and Cleopatra is part of this kind of this larger complex of plays in Shakespeare, where he seems very interested in ancient wisdom as encrypted in mythology, right? Last week we talked about how ancient wisdom is encrypted in proverbs and maxims. Seneca compared proverbs to seeds, that if you planted them properly in your own writing or in your own spiritual exercise, they could flower in the form of sagesse, of wisdom, of sapience. But wisdom also takes the form of myth, and especially this pagan wisdom that was in one of my slides, that wisdom can also be encrypted in myth. And this is something which, all of the Italian humanist philosophers, Ficino and Pico, but also Erasmus, were fascinated in, and the great painters, Botticelli, were fascinated in Michelangelo, the way in which these myths, which were distributed globally, so there'd be Egyptian versions and Greek and Roman versions and Persian versions, right? We could find these different elements in different parts of the world that were transmitting these mythic truths, these kind of cosmological teachings. So that's what's gotten me kind of all hot and bothered about Cleopatra, is the way in which wisdom gets linked up globally, and the way in which wisdom gets linked up to mythology, and the way that it gets linked up to feminine or feminized practices of spiritual exercise that are distinct from what we see elsewhere in the tradition. So those are some of my thoughts. I know we just have, yes, another comment?
Yeah, just a brief comment.
Yes.
Cleopatra puts on her crown. She dies as the Queen of England, as the Queen of Egypt.
Yes.
She does not die as a captive.
Yes.
So her dying as a queen brings stature not just to herself, but to her country that is now overrun and is going to be taken over by another country. So her pride is what is there. And I think she dies with grace and with dignity as herself.
Well, I agree. And I think Shakespeare gives her that. And there are other representations of Cleopatra's death in which she is more scared, more furtive. The snake is an easy way out. If she were really a Stoic, she would use a knife, she would use a dagger. So there are very negative portrayals of this death. But I think Shakespeare works hard to, or finds himself, whether, because again, I think she sort of seduces him with her mythic power, but he finds himself giving her dignity, which is royal and cosmic.
Julia, Maya has something to say.
Yes. Oh, yes, Maya, please, our Cleopatra, please.
Yeah, just from the actor's perspective, I think playing this role, you have to play all in with Antony. You have to commit to loving him versus thinking, oh, maybe I'm just kind of getting power through these different it's like, that's not an interesting, no one wants to sit through 2 hours of that. They want to see love, as we're all here to see in all of his plays. True love, right? So it's like, oh, that's the stronger choice as far as an actor, is like you're all in with him. And so that is definitely part of her suicide, I believe, and why she doesn't try to conquer this next Caesar again. And maybe she's tired.
She doesn't want another lover.
She doesn't, you know, she doesn't,
She's 38, you know.
She's old, you know, she's not old. She's done. I think that's that she had enough and she found it. Another lovely line that he gives her at the very end is, "What should I stay?" And I worked with Beth Lopes on this, who directs a lot of our plays at Swan, and she's amazing. And we were talking about this last line and what to do with it, and how if we were actually staging it, maybe Charmian could say something like, you know, or like go reach to her like, "Oh, I wish you wouldn't die," like hold her hand or something. Or it's that second, and we kind of talked a little bit about, I've heard, I haven't done much research, but when someone actually commits suicide and they jump, they actually, and people who survive don't actually, they, in their moment of jumping, they realize that they didn't want to jump, right? They want to live at that very end. And so, of course, for the actor, that line is so, it could be taken so many different ways. What should I stay here? Do I want to stay here? What should I stay? Dies. Or like, wait, what? Maybe this isn't what I should have done. And she reaches for that second snake as well, because maybe it's too painful. Maybe it's, I don't know. So there's so many things to have fun and play with in the speech. But just as far as her intention, I think as far as a theatrical piece as what this is, you know, I think boom, love always is always the answer.
Can I add another actory comment?
Please do.
Absolutely.
Not to take away from Maya and her marvelous performance, but one of the abiding bitternesses of my life is I was cast as Cleopatra when I was 14 and was unable to take up the role because I had other plans. But I was going to tour Turkey with the Oxford and Cambridge Shakespeare Company as Cleopatra. So I've often thought about that part and thought, well, I've missed the boat. But one of the things that fascinates me is how Shakespeare, when you were talking about the status Cleopatra achieves at the end, one of the brilliant things is how he has written this for a boy. Yeah. I mean, to say that she makes hungry where most she satisfies is the very definition of somebody who is performing a femininity which never satisfies, but which always makes you yearn. Now, my argument would be that the ambiguity of a boy makes hungry where most he satisfies, whereas any individual woman is that woman, and she can't transcend it. And one of Cleopatra's fears as she goes to die is that, my God, some boy is going to play me in Rome. And of course, that is a boy saying that. So when he finally is poisoned by the asp and stops moving in his crown and his robe, he has transcended his own performance and turned into something which we can read anything into. But he doesn't have to be a boy playing her anymore because he's dead. And that it is a supreme bit of Shakespearean wit to create the myth that and the status sort of which you've been talking about, Julia, by a theatrical trick that says, I can't have a boy play me, so I must die. And that boy dies and is still. It seems very witty and very moving at the same time.
Well, it's a very knowing play.
Yes.
You know, because there is so much layer of hermeneutics, of commentary on Cleopatra.
But
on the one hand, Shakespeare is kind of just dramatizing Plutarch, but he's also engaging these rich discourses which are theatrical.
But, you know, limited as he was by the laws of the land, he has transcended that wonderfully in Cleopatra.
Did Maya want to respond to that? You looked like you were.
Oh no, you can finish. I agree. That's such an amazing how clever he is always.
Well, listen, guys, we're really at the hour. And so you guys have been wonderful as always. Maya, I want to thank you for a beautiful performance.
Next week, I'm going to talk about a few sonnets. So we'll be moving from plays to poems. And I'll try to speak about them in a way that turns the time we have together into more of a conversation. So we'll send you 2 sonnets if we can fit them into the automated message to the group. And I just encourage you to read your heart out while you read those sonnets. Anything that you notice that's interesting about those sonnets will be relevant to our discussion next week.